So far, you have had an introduction to the system itself. Dr. Hajar presented the pathways and the areas of excellence, and Dr. Salmon went into some detail about how your accomplishments are measured and how the committee of review makes a decision and deliberates as to whether you meet the criteria for promotion. And I think the third part of this presentation then is to make sure that, at least to try to make sure that you feel that this process is transparent. I know that it's a lot to sort of, digest all at once. And I would also say that one of the reasons that we're doing this is that we hear in a number of ways how confusing it is for some faculty members. They don't understand the system, they don't understand the process. So that's our goal, is to try to clarify this for you. And you should know that the Office of Faculty Affairs and the Office of Faculty Development are here to help answer your questions and to guide you through this process if you're interested in getting promoted. So having said that, are there any questions about what you've heard so far, other than the one that we've had? Yes?
In the slide where there were examples of teaching, can you give an example of administrative teaching? I was wondering.
Sure. If you run a course, if you're a director, then you're the administrative person who's making the course happen. You're making sure that people come in and give their lectures when they're supposed to. Residency program coordinators, or directors, I should say, and even higher level, academic teaching, administrative activities. Yeah. So I want to also remind you that all of this policy information is in the Academic Staff Handbook, in case you don't know that already, and that's available online on our website. Okay, so we're going to talk about how this all happens, or at least I'm going to try to go through it and summarize it. It would be difficult, and we'd need a lot more time to, go through this in minute detail. But we can do that offline, certainly, if you're interested. Perhaps one way to start this discussion is with this idea of a timeline. In other words, and there's a tradition here, I think, behind this picture. And that tradition is an academic tradition, and you start your career as a faculty member in an academic institution, as an assistant professor, perhaps as an instructor. And typically your expectation is, when you were in graduate school getting your doctorate or your MD degree, that if you wanted an academic career, you'd go from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor. And in many cases, that meant tenure, and so that was the typical career trajectory. So in some sense, that is the genesis of this diagram. But in an academic, I should say, medical, academic medical center institution, things get a little bit different because, as Kathy pointed out, because of the tenure issue, in a sense. In contrast to a university or a typical college, where if you don't get tenure, you're looking for another job. Most people, faculty here, don't get tenure, and they get to keep their jobs and even get promoted because of the nature of the medical enterprise. Okay, having said that then, what this diagram is saying is that you can start out as an instructor at the medical college, spend 3 years or so, and there are constraints with some of these appointments, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in a few minutes. But typically by year 3 of your instructor appointment, you go up for promotion. In our system, it's also possible not to go up for promotion and to remain as an instructor, but that's predominantly in the clinical departments, because instructor in clinical medicine is a bona fide title. We don't really have a parallel title in the basic science departments. And there are reasons that instructors use more often in a basic science department than it is in a clinical department as an initial faculty appointment. But here you are at year 3, you're promoted to assistant professor. This promotion from instructor to assistant professor is not committee reviewed at the college level. This is a departmental decision, although ultimately, of course, the dean is presented with the recommendation for this type of promotion and needs to approve it. So either you're promoted from instructor to assistant professor, or you're initially appointed as an assistant professor. And the typical timeline, as you can see down here, is about 6 years. The 6 years is a sort of classic period of time before promotion decision is made, and in some cases, it's often made with tenure at the associate professor rank. I would say that at the medical college, tenure upon promotion to associate professor is rare. If tenure ever enters the picture, it's later, say around here. These are not hard and fast intervals, as this points out. In fact, if you're not on a time-constrained appointment, this may very well be 6, 7, 8 years. And I'll show you some data later that suggests that the average length of time for people who do get promoted here is more than 6 years, from assistant to associate. In line with the sort of tenure clock, you see this 3-year period as an associate professor before promotion to professor occurs. And again, that is tied to the classic tenure clock. But putting tenure aside, or tenure eligibility aside, one can remain an assistant professor until one is ready to be promoted. Likewise, one can remain an associate professor until ready for promotion. And once you're a professor, you've reached the top of the chain, as it were, and you've come to the pinnacle of your career, in a sense. Although there is a rank that's higher than professor, but perhaps we don't need to talk about that. If you were really interested, you can look at the handbook and discover what it is. So what this, the take-home lesson here is approximately 6 years after your initial appointment as an assistant professor, you're ready for promotion. But consider that a lot of stuff has to happen in those 6 years. And you're not going to wake up, on the first day of your 7th year thinking that promotion's just going to happen automatically. You have to do a lot of work for that to happen. Okay, any questions about this timeline? Okay, one of the things that, yes?
I have a question about the tenure eligibility. How clear is it whether or not you're eligible?
It should be very clear to you if you're tenure eligible, if you're a relatively new faculty member, because when the policies changed in 2015, they changed in a manner that said, you will be informed in writing clearly if you're eligible for tenure review. So if you were hired as an assistant professor 2015 or later, you would have gotten an appointment offer letter, and that is where you'd see whether the letter says you're eligible for tenure review or not. You're being hired as a tenure review eligible faculty member or not. The letter will say that. If it doesn't say that, you're not tenure review eligible. And if you read your letter and you didn't see that, and you didn't understand it, that was the time to say something, or now. But it's explicitly in writing. Now, yes? For faculty members hired before 2015, It's a little bit different because the old system, it was implicit that if you were hired as an assistant professor at the medical college, by and large, you were hired as a tenure track assistant professor by default. And in that case, the college and the department is obligated to conduct its review of your accomplishments along the timeline we just saw. Okay, so if you were hired as an assistant professor in 2013, then by now there, will have been a review as to whether you're going to be put up for promotion or perhaps get an extension of 1 year time and rank, or decide with your chair and your mentors that the tenure review eligibility isn't, for me. Okay, is that clear?
Just to make it even more clear, so if you're tenure eligible, you're married to this timeline, 6 years and 9 years.
There's a clock.
Whereas the pledge that you were talking about earlier, whether or not you could be 6 years or 8 years in the assistant professor track, does not apply to people who are tenure eligible.
Does not apply for people who are not tenure eligible, yes.
But people who are tenure eligible have to abide by this timeline.
Well, what has to happen is that a review must occur by the 6th year. And if the review doesn't lead to a recommendation for promotion to associate professor, there's a little bit of leeway in that one can get an extension of 1 year. And there are other circumstances under which the clock can be stopped. If you've had children along the way and you write to faculty affairs, the clock can be automatically stopped for 1 year. But you need to do that. Now, if you do have the review at the 6th year and promotion, you're not ready for promotion, but you're faced with that constraint on a tenure clock, it's okay to come off the tenure track, as it were, because you can get promoted when you're ready to be promoted. At least I think it's okay, although there are, many faculty members who, would rather not have to have that happen, but yes.
So generally, if it's supposed to happen by the end of the 6th year, how much earlier do we have to turn in materials? I assume there's some...
The review should happen actually by the end of the 5th year, so that if the recommendation for promotion is to go forward, there is a year in which to accomplish that review at the college level. And when I say review, the review that I'm talking about initially is at the department level, okay? The department needs to make a recommendation for your promotion. Now, how many of these reviews happen by the end of the 5th year? I couldn't say, but I can say not all of them do happen by the end of the 5th year. And again, there's leeway built into the system. Yeah. Yes?
I assume that tenure eligibility does not apply to voluntary faculty.
It does not, yes. In fact, tenure eligibility does not apply to voluntary faculty. Does everyone know what voluntary faculty are? So we have a very dedicated and loyal group of faculty members who the college doesn't employ, who have private practices in the area, and who nonetheless contribute to the programs of the medical college, teaching, for example. And these are called voluntary faculty members. Their titles sound something like clinical professor of medicine. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about recruitment of faculty mid-career from other institutions and why the institution does what it does in that regard? As far as bringing people in and, so to speak, demoting them and then making them prove again that they were at the level they were at?
It's an artifact.
Is that a normal practice?
You mean the interim, assistant professor interim? Yeah.
Why is that?
We struggle with this because I know it's very sort of disturbing. So what the question has to do with the fact that, and I can tell you that years ago, we didn't have this problem because departments, the college was smaller, departments were hiring in a sort of normal mode. But now, because of, the growth and the competition, Department X has to hire this full professor, and they have to start in 2 months. We cannot get the review done in 2 months. But in order to get on the payroll, you need a faculty appointment. So we have assistant professor interim, and unfortunately, it tends to stick around on websites and so forth, and so it's visible publicly, and it's disturbing. Now, we've tried so many different ways to get rid of this, but we just can't seem to figure out a way to say, okay, you're a professor of, pharmacology, I don't know, pending review? Does that sound any better?
So are there any institutions where that's not the case? I mean, in other words, anywhere outside they come in as that
Yeah.
to prove once again that they're supposed to be at that level?
Okay, I've heard anecdotally that, that doesn't happen at so-and-so place, but I don't know for sure. But you just said something that makes me think maybe I didn't quite understand your question. If you're saying, if someone was a professor at Harvard, why can't they just be appointed professor here without a review? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much. That's a good question, right?
Yeah, yes.
Every appointment must be made by the committee of review, the executive faculty council, general faculty council, to the board of officers. That is the process. So we are not permitted to rubber stamp an appointment that was granted by another institution. That's the rule. So that's why we have to do that.
Well, but that idea certainly has come up many times, and who knows? There may be something in the future where some kind of policy is proposed and the faculty agrees to it. I don't know, but you have to remember, it's not only the medical college, it's Cornell University, so that's a complicated sort of question. Yeah, yes, I'm sorry.
There's a lot of interest in tenure, but in terms of how frequent it's given out,
Yeah.
if you consider an assistant professor, wouldn't you say that less than 1% of our assistant professors would even be considered for tenure?
Ultimately, down the road? I don't know the number, but sure, it's quite small. Yep. I don't know, less than 1% of
And
the,
it's always a pathway of scholarship.
yes, it must be a scholar pathway.
Almost always an endeavor of
Investigation, exactly. Yes.
If it's not those, it's extremely rare.
Yes.
And since most assistant professors are not on that path or that endeavor, you can almost rule it out from the beginning.
I agree. It's more, seems more sensitive to the basic scientists than the clinicians. And I think people would probably be happier if they just focused on what they did well and do it and forget that tenure business.
It's important to underscore what we just heard. Individuals on the pathway of excellence, any of the three, tenure's not questioned. It's only individuals who are appointed, hired, or promoted on academic achievement and scholarship. And that is not the majority of all the faculty out
Right, and among those who are hired, not all of them are told they're eligible for tenure review. Yes.
So along the same lines, I was wondering, among those who are tenure eligible and are on this timeline and then go for promotion and then not recommended for promotion, I think you said this earlier, are they invited to stay in other capacities generally, or are they?
Oh, yes.
looking for-
No, again, it's not up or out. That was the point I was trying to make initially, that in contrast to your typical university, it's not up or out. And again, It's also possible, and I'll say this, you know, you could stay here for 20 years, be promoted to associate and full professor, and not be eligible for tenure review, and have accomplished so much that at that point, you know, it's possible to be recommended for tenure.
So what does tenure here actually mean?
Right.
Exactly? So what does it imply? Because I know that most other institutions, tenure is much more frequent than 1%.
Right,
It's not,
right.
not 100% for sure, but
It's 8% of that.
Well, it's 8% of the current.
Of the total faculty, but of assistant professors, right. Are, yeah.
so what is that?
Tenure, there are two aspects to tenure. Academic freedom, which is the traditional sort of rationale for tenure. You can, as a professor in your classroom, if you say something that, you know, politically somebody might not like, you can't be fired for that, for your position. Probably the more relevant or, you know, aspect is a guarantee of financial support until retirement or otherwise dismissal, which, you know, but the nature of that support, however, is not specified. You know, it just, the policy is that tenure guarantees salary support until retirement. So those are the two components of tenure at Cornell. Yes?
When you showed the numbers for tenure eligible, like males and females, it was similar, but then for achieving tenure, there was a huge discrepancy. Why is
Mhm.
that?
The million-dollar question.
That's a historical issue.
Mm.
Most of the tenured professors are above 60. And the shift of tenure.
Sure, the question was, go ahead, Jane.
Very few tenured women, and there are an equal number of tenure eligible women. And I think that's related to the hiring demographic of the more recent faculty. It's not because women are turned down. And in fact, I'll point out that in the committee of review, over 95%, every person proposed. And that includes Memorial, Cutter, over 95% of people proposed get the money. So once you're at the level of the department, and supporting you and dossier complete, it's unusual to not move forward. The roadblocks are kind of getting, you and your chair or your division have to agree, you have to put together the portfolio, you have to be comfortable with what the pathway is, all that stuff, and Mark will tell you about that now. I think it's really important to go over the process, but that's where the roadblock is, it's not in the committee. And women get more promoted than men, it's like 97 versus 90.
So what do you need to do? You need to prepare a wild Cornell format CV, and because we use this along the way in a number of cases. And as Jane pointed out, there's a new version on the horizon, so please keep your eyes out for that. We are offering help from an OFA, yes.
It's been mentioned several times that the PCB
Mhm.
is pending, and I know I've heard that before in prior talks. So I was just wondering if there's an estimated timeline for when that seems.
I think quite soon. In fact, we're sort of piloting it now with some test cases. And
A focus group, a final focus group of faculty, administrators, and
yeah,
people to make sure they're happy with it, so that we don't roll it out and get a lot of comments that we don't.
yeah, it's done. It's just now we need to make sure everybody's happy with it. And OFA will, if you need help with the CV, whether it's the old one or the new one, feel free to call us or email us. We will help guide you through that. You have annual meetings with your chair or your chair's designee, and each department has its own little process for reviewing faculty for promotion. You should take advantage of those meetings. For associate and full professor and tenure appointments, OFA will solicit the evaluation letters from names that have been submitted by the department, often by the faculty members themselves, to the department. Once we get those letters, we return them to the department. The department deliberates again and decides whether or not to move the recommendation forward. When the recommendation goes forward, OFA gets it on the next committee of review meeting. The committee of review meets 11 times a year, every month except for August. Once it gets through committee of review, it goes to the 2 faculty councils, which also meet more or less monthly. And following the councils, it goes to the dean for final approval. It comes back to OFA, and OFA records the promotion or the appointment and sends out correspondence. Yes. Mhm.
You may submit letters to your chair that will then get names of letter writers, external evaluators, to your chair, and those names may get transferred to Office of Faculty Affairs. It's really important not to contact them directly, not to tell them they're going to write a letter, because if that becomes clear, the letter really isn't valid. So if all of that is removed from you and even removed from your chair, it comes from our office.
Yeah. Right. The evaluators are really important. So choose them wisely, and that's a critical component of the dossier. I'm not going to go through this slide because we've talked a lot about tenure, but I would advise you to read Section 3 of the handbook if you're really interested. The other thing about tenure is that even if you're the most tenureable faculty member, if there isn't a slot in your department for tenure, it's off the table. And the dean decides if there's a tenure slot. There's something called this probationary period for tenure review, which is 9 years, which I alluded to before. Enough said. There's a maximum time and rank on assistant professor tenure eligible appointments. As I said earlier, that's 6 years. There's also a maximum time and rank on unmodified instructor appointments, which is 3 years. That was reflected in the earlier timeline slide. But again, not everyone is subject to a maximum time and rank, in particular associate and full professors who may be hired initially at those ranks as tenure review eligible. They can stay associate or full professors without getting tenure, although they must be reviewed for tenure in 3 years from their hire. So it's a little bit a different timeline for those types of people. This tries to summarize the various steps the different levels of faculty appointment go through. Lower rank faculty and non-faculty academic staff, such as research associates and postdocs, go straight from the department to OFA and approval by the dean. Upper rank new faculty, associate professors and professors are approved by the committee of review, as I mentioned, then the faculty councils and by the dean. And of course, this is prior to all of the other stuff that has to happen, getting letters and review at the department level. And finally, for tenure, you see that it's even a much more involved process. In fact, tenure is approved ultimately by the Board of Overseers. This is some data about how long it's taking us to do these things, to get these recommendations through the system. We've sort of begun tabulating this data, and you might not be too happy looking at this data, but I'll just go through it. I think we're getting better, but as you know, there are a lot of steps. So in 2017-18, it was about 8.6 weeks between the time OFA got a request to start an evaluation and actually began soliciting letters. It's about 11 weeks on average between initiating solicitation and completing getting letters. Another 7 weeks between the department having gotten all the letters and deciding to make a recommendation. And then the shortest period is from the department's recommendation to the committee of review. And that makes sense because usually, as I said, the committee meets monthly, so we get a recommendation, it goes to the next meeting. If we have time, I can talk about why some of these take so long. If you add all of this up and look at the total amount of time it takes from the initial request for evaluation to review by the committee of review, you see on average it's about 30 weeks. But you also see that in some cases it happens much more quickly than that, but in some cases it also happens a lot more slowly than that. Okay, so just so you get an idea of how long this can sometimes take, how long it takes on average. If you think your application has fallen into a rabbit hole somewhere, it hasn't. Just know that it takes time, be patient, and feel free to ask us where things stand. So finally, to summarize, if you want to get promoted academically, if you want that kind of academic career, assistant, associate, full professor, start early and talk to people in your department, especially your chair, your division chief. Seek advice from mentors and other senior faculty members. Use the annual faculty review and other types of meetings to document your activities and to get that guidance and keep the ball rolling. Because if you're not going to wake up at the end of your 5th year and think, promotion is just going to happen. It's not a passive process. It requires plenty of effort, in addition to what you're doing, in your jobs. So, are we good with time? Yes? Okay. I think on behalf of Dr. Hajar and Dr. Salmon, thank you very much for coming. If there are questions still, we're happy to answer them.